My name is Radwan Masmoudi. I'm the president of the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy. It gives me a great pleasure to welcome all of you to this webinar today. As you know, yesterday marked the second anniversary of the coup, if we can say that. And this is an event to try to evaluate the situation in Tunisia 2 years after the coup. Where is Tunisia headed politically and economically? What has been the main, failures or accomplishments of the Qais Said regime in the last 2 years? How do you predict the situation moving forward? And especially the main question is there a path forward for democracy to return to Tunisia? And how might that happen? How might democracy return to Tunisia after this coup? And I'm pleased that we have today with us 3 experts on this topic. Mr. Abdelrazak Al-Kilani, of course, is very well known. He is the former dean of the National Bar Association of Tunisia, even before the revolution of 2011. He held several positions, including former minister in charge of relations with the National Constituent Assembly between 2011 and 2012. And he was also former ambassador, representative of Tunisia to the United Nations at Geneva between 2013 and 2014. He also was president of the Independent Commission for Transitional Justice and the Rights of the Victims of Oppression and Corruption between 2019 and 2021. And he is a founding member of the National Salvation Front in Tunisia. And Mr. Kilani is, of course, a lawyer, and he is now in exile in Paris. After Mr. Kilani, we will have Mr. Tariq Mjrisi. He's a senior policy fellow with the Middle East and North Africa program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. His work focuses on European policies towards the Maghreb and the Mediterranean region. Mr. Mjrisi has worked with various regional, European, and multilateral authorities on providing reform and stabilization assistance to transitional states in the Middle East and North Africa. He has been involved with a range of projects, including post-conflict stabilization, development and democratization, Libya's domestic and international political processes, economic reform in Tunisia, and the Eastern Mediterranean disputes. And finally, we have Professor Andrew Marsh. Professor Marsh is a professor of political science at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. His research and teaching interests are in the areas of political philosophy, Islamic law and political thought, religion and political theory, and comparative and non-Western political theory more generally. He has written several books. His first book was Islam and Liberal Citizenship, The Search for an Overlapping Consensus. It was published in 2009. His second book, The Caliphate of Men, The Invention of Popular Sovereignty in Modern Islamic Thought, was published by Harvard University in 2019. And he has a third book that's just come out or is coming out very soon on Muslim democracy. Is that the title, Andrew? Muslim Democracy?
On Muslim Democracy, Essays and Dialogues, and it's together with Sheikh Rashid.
With Sheikh Rashid Ghannouchi. Okay, very good. It's a pleasure to have all of you. We have, each speaker will have about 15 minutes to answer the questions that we sent you by email, and then we will open it to the floor for Q&A. We'll start with Dr. Kilani. Mr. Kilani, go ahead, please.
Hello to le monde, everybody. Thank you, Mr. Masmoudi, dear friend, for this invitation. Tunisia celebrated yesterday also the proclamation of the Republic. And when the Republic is proclaimed, Tunisian people thought that they will live in a real republic with his values and his principle. The values of republic, as you know, is the institutions, the democracy, the accept of the power, the changing the power, the elections, and they are surprised by living during the power of Bourguiba and Ben Ali in a despotic regime. And so there is Tunisian people who had fighting to gain the democracy, to gain the freedoms. And we have, as you know, we have our revolution, the revolution of the freedom and dignity. You called it in the Occident the revolution of Jasmin. And you know, we have sacrifice. Tunisians have sacrifice. We have martyrs and bloods, and so we think since 2011 that we have gain our freedom and will be a regime, a democratic regime. You know, during the transition act after the revolution, when Ben Ali has left the country, we have organized the civil society have organized the situation, and we have all body agree to organize election to elect a national assembly constitution, to prepare a new constitution. And we have in 2011, as you know, the first democratic elections in Tunisia, and we have elected this institution which prepare as a new constitution. As you know, I think that we have do a very beautiful constitution with modern system, with the three powers, executive, legislative, and judiciary power, and with the separate power. There is a balance between the three powers, and we have known some difficulties with, you know, we have two political crimes. As you know, two leaders was killed during this period, and instead of all this, Tunisians succeed their democratic transition. And we had after the constitution, the new after the voted of the new constitution, we have two elections in 2040 and in 2090. And as you know, in 2090 we have elected a president, which is Qais Said, after the death of the President Essebsi. And we thought that we have a pact, which is the constitution, and nobody can change the game, the political game, because of this constitution, which was voted by the majority of the members of the assembly constitution. And as you know, Qais Said has done his coup in 2021, with using the Article 18 of the Constitution, when he stopped the Parliament, suspended the action of the Parliament, and put out the chief of the government and his ministers. And so when he do his coup, he promised for people that who will change the situation, because we have before a very bad political situation. There is some fights in the parliament, as in each parliament in the world, and there is a coup to put end to the revolution. So people have afraid of this political situation, and Qais Said profit of this situation and do his coup, and we find that he will stop it in this way. And but as you know, he continued his coup when he suspended the parliament, and as you know, he dissolved also the Tunisian anti-corruption authority, and dissolved the and after this there is other steps by dissolving the parliament in 31 March of 2022, and after this he proposed, after suspending the constitution, he proposed a new constitution with who had prepared himself without any consultation with the civil society and organization and other political parties. And he passed this constitution and was adopted by a referendum, as you know, in 25 of July 2022. And also in 70 December 2022, he organized a legislative election to elect a parliament. And as you know, the coup is in fact it is not to change the situation for a better situation, because he promised, as I say, to fight corrupted, to fight les voleurs, and as you know, his idea is to put his hand on all the powers. And as you know, if you haven't the judiciary power, you haven't all the power. So he decided, as you know, and announced on the right of February to 6/22 from the headquarters of the Ministry of the Interior, the dissolution of the High Judicial Council in the presence of senior security officials involved in the intimidation of all the magistrates. Before this decision, as you know, in official speech, he conducted a campaign of defamation against judges, and declared that justice is only a function in total denial of the constitutional principles of the independence of the judicial power and international standard of judicial independence. Also, we have to remember that the High Judicial Council is an independent institution created by the Constitution of 2040 as the guarantor of the independence of the judicial power and accords with the Constitution and international standards and guarantees of the separation of powers and balance between them. To ensure that judicial bodies are protected from pressure of interference in the professional career of judges. But Qais Said has another idea. His idea is distract the dissolution by the dissolution of the constitutional institution to submit the judicial power to the executive power, and in a system in which the President of Republic has all the power in his hand. And you know what he do after, because the question is why doesn't he do all this? Because he know that because judicial independent power is guarantees of establishment of the administration of justice and the primacy of the Constitution and the sovereignty of the law and the protection of rights and freedoms, as say the Article 102. But he used all this, and he, as you know, he organized political trial against prisoners, against personality with opening investigation against members of the political opposition, against lawyer, against judge, against businessmen, and on unfounded accusation of conspiracy against the state, trying to change the nature of the state, and he do arbitrary detention in relation of their political activism or speech. He also...
Oui. We only have about 3 minutes left in your talk. So thank you for this historical review of what happened in the last 2 years. But can you focus on the present situation in Tunisia right now and the future? Where do you think what do you predict the future holds for Tunisia and for the democratic transition in Tunisia? What is your view of what will happen in the next year or 6 months or 2 years? Where is Tunisia headed?
I think with all what Qais Said has done during 2 years, it is a fiasco. During 2 years, the situation of Tunisian people go bad than bad, and as you know, the social situation of Tunisian now, Tunisian are all day looking for food, for bed, and they are living. Tunisians are living in a bad situation because of the échec of the political
failure.
Because Qais Said hasn't a project, hasn't a program for the country, because he isn't he hasn't the experience of directed state. He's a simple professor of law, and he wasn't known by his for example fighting for freedoms or fighting against the regime, the despotic regime. So I think that with this economic, with this social situation, I think that Qais Said will be put out by Tunisian people, by when Tunisian people will have angry with and will know that Qais Said will first he's كذاب
Liar.
Olota, yes, and
Liar.
Qais Said hasn't anything to give to the people.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much, Saad Razak. We'll come back to you during the Q&A session. We now go to Mr. Tariq Majrisi. Tariq, you have the floor. You have about 15 minutes.
Thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me here to be a panelist. I'll try my best to convey my points as quickly as possible so we have as much time for a Q&A afterwards. And you know, I've been asked here today to focus on Europe, on the position of the EU, on some of the international positioning and activities since the coup more generally. But before I do, you know, as I was writing my remarks, I just wanted to make an initial comment, which is kind of inspired by this title of the session. You know, is there a path forward for democracy in Tunisia? Which I hope will also actually underwrite and kind of frame out the rest of what I have to say, or at least the more actionable points of it. You know, democracy is not some kind of fixed thing that you achieve, that you can have and then can be taken away afterwards. And this is how it's often depicted, especially in conversations now about Tunis. You know, democracy is a practice. It's a regular activity that you're supposed to do on a day-to-day basis. Before President Said's coup, Tunisia practiced it a bit more, but they didn't practice it all that well. And you can measure how well it practices that democracy by how much the popular need is reflected in policymaking. But nevertheless, despite any of the shortcomings of Tunisian democracy before Said, since the coup, the practicing of democracy has become entirely negligible. You know, it's rarely practiced at all. And when it is, like with the constitutional process or the parliamentary elections, it's kind of just going through the motions, like a stage production of democracy, or what democracy should look like rather than the thing itself. But as I said, given democracy is not a fixed thing that can be had or taken away, it means that there most definitely is a way forward. We just have to start practicing it again. And it depends on how we can start practicing it again and how we can start to translate the popular need, because the need right now is truly great, into policy positions that make sense, policy positions that are actionable and that resonate with the people. And I truly believe that if we can all focus on that, then the rest of the politics will start to sort itself out in time, because the political situation that Tunis is stuck in right now can only actually become unstuck by shifting our focus towards popular policy in that way. But after that kind of brief bit about Tunis, I do want to zoom out a bit to look at Europe, to look at the European Union. I spend a lot of my time working on European policy, and I understand that it can be a bit confusing at times for those who are blessed by not having to have this close association, because Europe is kind of weird as a policy creature. It's like the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde of international relations, because you have the EU, the European Union, this big administrative body, but then you also have all of the member states, who are often very different to one another. And it's good to keep in mind that it is the member states who drive foreign policy in Europe. The EU does not have the prerogative to set foreign policy. They just enable or kind of backfill what the member states want to do. And there are another kind of couple of general points to keep in mind when we talk about Europe and about European foreign policy. The first is that the Europeans are not united. The name European Union is a bit deceiving. You will see that a lot of the different capitals have their own perspectives. In many cases, they even compete with each other. We see this more clearly in other spheres than Tunis, but it's still something to keep in mind. And so we can't speak of one European position. We can speak of different dynamics that might coalesce into a general policy position. The second thing to keep in mind is that, you could phrase this general European policy right now towards Tunis is that, the European heart is with Tunisia and with Tunisian democracy, but the European head is not really with Tunis right now. And what I mean by this is that the EU, the European values, a lot of those kind of working and staffing desks, they would really like to be doing more, or to know what they could do to support a return to Tunisian democracy. But the individual member states and often the leaders of these countries, they don't see it as practical. They see having kind of the situation in front of them is that they have this dictator. Dictators are easy to work with. They have, these hard policy issues that they feel like they need to deal with right away. And this is what they focus on. So the third point is that what is coming out from Europe right now as Tunisia policy is mostly reactive. There is no Tunisia strategy or overarching Tunisian policy. It's kind of just responding to developments as they occur on the ground. And so in these responses, the Europeans and the different European actors kind of showcase a lot about the different sentiments and priorities that they have. And we can see two poles on this. So on one side, we have Germany, and we can see the kind of biggest moves that Germany has made towards Tunis. There was a wave of considerable concern when Rashid Ghannouchi was arrested, especially from the Bundestag, the German parliament, because I think a lot of the parliaments saw this as the big sign that Tunisian democracy has died, right? They are MPs, they see Tunisian MPs being arrested, they feel that sense of solidarity and they wanted to act. And the other side is the economy. They see that the Tunisian economy is in a dire position. Southern Europe really wants them to try to help support them. So they will continue to provide budget support, but they don't know how much they should really tread this line, because it's not a good political look to be giving money to a dictator. And it's kind of hard to justify to the tax payers why you're giving their money towards a dictatorship, despite Tunisia's dire need for budget support. The opposite of this more moral kind of German position are the Italians right now. The Italian prime minister is very much playing to her crowd. She's fully focused on using Tunis quite cynically to stop migration. She wants to see some element of stability in Tunis. And so she's working very hard behind the scenes to get the IMF to basically just give a no conditions loan to Tunis. For her, she doesn't seem to have a deep understanding or even care for the situation. She just sees these crises as headline crises and thinks that these are the easy and simple ways to deal with them. And I would say that most of the Southern Europeans are more of the Italian way of thinking. They are quite happy having a single entity to deal with. I kind of feel like they're more comfortable with the dictatorship a lot of times. And they have a very good working relationship with the security services that kind of compensates for the incompetence of Kais Saied, because it's very difficult to get President Saied to stick to any particular point, to enact policy in any way, and so on. So the problems that might have occurred by working with Saied are mitigated somewhat because they feel like they know and they have a good working relationship with the Tunisian Interior Ministry and Defense Ministry and so on. And for some of these countries like France and even Italy, as we saw in the Rome conference that was held last Sunday, there is also a link towards other regional partners of these countries. And these partners, these local states like the United Arab Emirates and in Egypt, can be considered to be part of the Middle East broader counter-revolutionary camp, who don't have any sympathy towards democratic transitions in the region, but are quite sympathetic towards restoring direct rule or dictatorships and so on. But from these European perspectives, from Paris, from Rome, and others, they are sympathetic to the perspectives of their partners. They prize the relationship. Paris prizes its relationship with Abu Dhabi. far more than it does with Tunis, because it's more economically important to them. They see it more as a regional ally and so on. And so they're not going to risk their relationships with these regional countries just for Tunisia's sake, especially when they see no way out of the current situation there. But the kind of bright side to this, I suppose, is that there are limits to the support that these counter-revolutionary actors will give to President Said. You know, the situation in Tunis is not like it is in Libya or in other countries whereby they are sending weapons and, you know, providing military support and so on. And we have seen Gulf states, the Saudis in particular, recently start, you know, providing money to President Said that might help him to kind of settle down in this dictatorship that he's building and take the sting out of his lack of economic policy. But I don't think it's really going to take the country anywhere. Again, given the lack of policy that Said is creating, the country will burn through these $400 million very quickly. And secondly, it won't last forever, as the Gulf states are less willing to provide kind of blank checks to failing states in the region, as the Egyptians are currently understanding now. It's important to note overall, I think, in terms of looking at European policy towards Tunis, that frankly, Tunisia is not a priority for Europe at the moment. Europe is completely consumed by the war in Ukraine, so that's its main and overarching priority. And even on a working level, there is an element of frustration with Tunisia, which a lot of Europeans, especially policymakers, kind of perceive as a target for considerable investment over the past 10 years, a project that they can never quite make to work. And the impression that they have is that Said is actually quite popular. So they are confused as to how exactly they're supposed to act now, what exactly they're supposed to do to support Tunisian democracy that is not violating Tunisian sovereignty. And, you know, they feel like it's not their responsibility to come up with a plan to salvage Tunis's economy and sell it to the Tunisians. They are waiting for somebody else to be the proactive one. But the kind of overarching emotion over the continent, I think even in countries like Italy, actually especially countries like Italy, is anxiety. You know, Tunisia's mode of governance is not Europe's primary concern. Whether it's a dictatorship or a democracy, what Europeans primarily want from Tunis is stability, some signs of a stable economy, and perhaps even economic growth, and a kind of working partner that they can build a relationship with on pressing issues like migration and counterterrorism, even though that's not so big anymore. And if they have that platform, then I think they would feel a lot more comfortable, and it's something that could open the door to more constructive conversations on economic cooperation, nearshoring businesses, green energy investment, in infrastructure investment under the Global Gateway Initiative, and so on. And I think it's important to remember that Tunis was previously expedited towards privileged partnership status with the EU, and Europe and the EU in general would like to see Tunis kind of become this beachhead for shared values and a very close trans-Mediterranean economic partnership that can then spread through the rest of the Maghreb region. But most of the member states and their leaders who kind of deal with Tunis are, as I said, happy to kind of deal with what they've got. They would like this, but they don't have it. And frankly, in their perspective, it seems increasingly like they just think that a dictator is easier to work with. But despite this kind of regressive policy position, this regressive perspective, it's good for all of us here to remember that the EU is not this nimble policy machine, right? It's an oil tanker. It takes a long time to turn. And so the EU and the EU policy machine is still very much geared up towards supporting Tunisian democracy. And if you want a great example of how that translates into EU politics, you should look at the recent EU Parliament session on Tunisia following this kind of Team Europe deal that the leaders of the Netherlands, Italy, and the European Commission signed with Said recently, where they were furious about how these kind of three leaders have kind of spoken on behalf of the EU and seem to have damaged Tunisian democracy further for a migration pact. So it's good to note that the opportunity is still there to kind of use Europe as a support mechanism towards supporting democratization in Tunis. Really, the Europeans just need to know how. They see currently no united opposition in Tunisia. They don't see an opposition that has any public respect, public support, or even the kind of competence required to dig Tunisia out of its current economic hole. They think that, you know, the last thing Tunis needs right now is more political upheaval. What it needs is credible economic policy. So in my opinion, and I'll kind of end on this, the best way for any Tunisian opposition to act now, and the best way to try to get support for democracy in Tunis and to signal to Europe and the kind of broader world that any Tunisian body is a body to support, is to not focus on politics. It's to not focus on Said, but to focus on a salvation plan for Tunis, to collaborate across ideological lines, to work out and then publicize, you know, very simple, credible sounding policies for economic reform, for spurring growth, deregulating the private sector and so on, the kind of things that can give people hope and show them what a way forward looks like. Because, you know, I see that nihilism is the strongest sentiment coming from the broader Tunisian population right now, which is a very dangerous place to be. And if you can do that, if you can chart out a credible way forward, then I think you will have the Europeans lining up behind you to try to support this plan, putting pressure on Said to not stand in the way of this plan. And you will even have the kind of Tunisian street, so to speak, doing the advocacy. And then it becomes a self-propagating thing from there. You know, ideas are much harder to silence than people are. And on that point, I'll hand it back. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tarek, for an excellent presentation. We go now to Professor Andrew Marsh. Andrew, you have the floor and you have about 15 minutes.
Thank you, Radwan. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you to my co-panelists, everybody who is logging in from around the world. I might not need all of the 15 minutes. The question of the panel is there a path forward for democracy in Tunisia? Obviously, this is a question about the future. No one can really know the future. I'm also not on the ground in Tunisia, obviously, so I don't really report with any kind of special authority or insight. But what I'd like to do instead is to make 8 very concise and specific points, separated into 2 categories. The first, I'm going to call headwinds, different kinds of factors that I think are working against a path forward for democracy in Tunisia. And then after that, what I'm going to call tailwinds, or a few factors that I think do still leave us with hope for a path forward for democracy in Tunisia. The first factor is what Tarek just spoke about, which is the very, very disappointing, discouraging, and even disgusting support from the West for Qais Said. Particularly Europe. I was surprised to hear some of the positive things that Tarek said about the heart of Europe being in favor. From my perspective, this may be a little bit too cynical, but I don't see any alternative. What Europe appears to care most about is the issue of migration. And so as long as Said is promising to do things about the flow of migrants to Europe, he sort of gets not a blank check, but in this case, I guess a 800 million euro check from Italy and other countries in the European Union. And that is, of course, extremely disappointing, because when you have some kind of democratic coup or anti-democratic coup or authoritarian backsliding, you start to look for various sorts of countervailing sources of power that would push against this. And as far as I can tell, none of those are coming from outside. And in fact, again, as Tarek said, all of the outside pressure from Abu Dhabi and other countries appears to be supporting the coup. The second factor that I'm considering a sort of headwind is that the opposition does appear to be in a kind of waiting mode. As Tarek just said, Europe does not see a united opposition. Whether or not the opposition is united, it appears to be in a position of waiting for some other kind of opportunity. There's obviously, and for good reason, a focus on political prisoners right now, a focus on campaigns to generate domestic and international outrage against political prisoners. but it's not clear to me that the opposition has a certain strategy for how they want to overturn the dictatorship. Third factor is, and if I'm wrong here, I'm very happy to be corrected. As far as I can tell, Qais Said's repression appears to be mostly against the political class. Now, it's fairly widespread. It's not just against the Islamists. There are also leftist and other secular leaders that have been imprisoned. But the fact that his repression, even though it's widening, it does appear to be targeted against the political class, and this may serve to a certain extent to temper popular resentment and popular anger against the regime. The fourth factor, as I see it, is that despite the apparent lack of enthusiasm for Said, I believe that there is probably still lagging popular dissatisfaction with the democratic transition, with parliament, so on and so forth. There's still a memory of the kinds of things that led people to either support the coup 2 years ago or to be ambivalent or to not have strong feelings of support for parliament. And so to the extent that a successful opposition needs a sense of what would follow the dictatorship, what people would be being led into, my sense is that there's still probably a lagging sense that the democratic transition was not uniformly popular. There was a lot of resentment against parliament across the ideological spectrum. And I suspect that still remains one of the factors in favor of the coup and the ongoing dictatorship. And the fifth factor is that despite looking like he is half dead, or despite looking kind of skeletal, or like he's a villain from a movie about what you would imagine a kind of grotesque creature to be, Qais Said is relatively young. He is only 65 years old. His demise is not imminent, probably. And so waiting out this particular dictatorship does not strike me as the most optimistic way forward. Now, having said that, I do think that there are at least three sources of optimism. First is that all of the factors that were on Tunisia's side since 2011 and before, I think are still to a large extent in play. So there's a reason why Tunisia had a relatively successful transition, a relatively bloodless transition, and was able to last for 10 years, unlike Egypt, not to mention the countries that immediately descended into civil war. These include that the oppositional coalition was broad. It was not limited to one ideological position, either leftist or Islamist or secular or anti-secular. There was a long history of cross-party communication and cooperation going back to the communication between various segments of the opposition abroad in Paris and in London, going back to years before the 2011 revolution. And I believe that in Tunisia, perhaps more than even in countries like Egypt, my hope and my sense is that the Tunisian people still have a kind of popular self-belief. They know that they overthrew a dictator. They know that this kind of thing is possible. And the coup did not happen through a kind of overwhelming show of violence like it happened in Egypt. It was a kind of slow constitutional presidential coup that has been, of course, very, very repressive, but I would hope did not lead to the sense that resistance and opposition to the state is futile. The second factor that I think supports hope in some kind of democratic return is just how awful of a president Qais Said has been. He has had an awful performance as a ruler. Everything that drove the opposition to parliament between 2019 and 2011 is worse. The economic crisis is worse. The environmental crisis is worse. Concerns about migration, so on and so forth. So there's no reason for Tunisians to believe that dictatorship makes things better, that dictatorship is a better alternative to democracy. So he's been an awful president. He's been an awful ruler. He has not given any hope that dictatorship can be more efficient, that it can be a better way to deliver economic and health results and other sorts of things. So I suspect that there was an underlying range of attitudes towards him that range from outright opposition and disdain to disgruntlement, to ambivalence, to a lack of care. And so I believe that that is a source of potential optimism. And finally, and this is more of a question, but I'm not sure that Qais Said is very successful at creating what we might call an apparatus of rule that is institutionally invested in dictatorship. So the reason why dictatorships are so difficult to successfully overthrow, and like Tariq said, a democratic transition is not a one-time event or success. It's a multi-year or multi-decade process of sustaining democracy and replacing forms of rule with something else. So dictatorships rely on all kinds of apparatuses of rule that are very, very difficult to dislodge. Perhaps a ruling party, an entrenched bureaucracy, military interests, media and cultural elites, a permanent administrative apparatus, what is sometimes called, it's now sort of become a cliche, but what we refer to as the deep state. I am not sure that he is very efficient and very driven to create these kinds of things that would make the opposition to the coup more about just opposing the person of Qais Said. And so I think he is somebody that very often alienates his own supporters. I know there are lots of people that either welcomed the coup or were somewhat ambivalent about it. And he has imprisoned some of them. He has alienated some of his closest advisors. His personality is clearly atrocious, touchy and imperious. And so I think that there are some reasons to believe that his personalistic way of ruling is not conducive to creating an alternative apparatus that is entrenched, that is bigger than one person, and that is much more difficult to overthrow than just overthrowing a single ruler. So I don't have a lot of more specific things to report about what's going on with the opposition or what's going on with popular sentiment. But as a political scientist and political theorist looking from outside, those are the factors that I think leave me pessimistic, leave me very, very sad about what's happened to Tunisia, a country that was a source of hope and inspiration for people throughout the Arab world and throughout the democracy-loving world, but then also a number of factors that leave me with hope and leave me with the belief that the democratic miracle in Tunisia is not yet over. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you all three panelists for really excellent presentations and also for staying on time. So now we open the floor to a Q&A. Anybody who has a question, you can ask a question in three different ways, either in chat, you can ask your questions in the chat section, or in Q&A section, or by raising your hand, and we'll try to give a chance to as many people as possible to ask questions, by using their mics. But let me ask the first question, which I think is the elephant in the room that has not been mentioned yet, which is the army and the role of the army in all of this. As we all know, the army in the beginning was supportive of Qais Said, was supportive of the coup, was used not only to close down the parliament, but also to try and convict several politicians and several critics of the coup. But the army seems to be retreating from that position lately, and seems to be more ambivalent about the coup, certainly in the last few months. What do you think is going on within the army? are they changing? Are they having second thought about what they did and what Qais Said is doing? Do you think there is a chance that the army might disengage and you know, stop supporting Qais Said? Anyone can answer this question. Abdrazak, you wanna start? Unmute yourself, please. Yes, go ahead.
As you say, Monsieur Radwan, when Qais Said did his coup, it seems that he was supported by the army, because, as you know, the parliament was closed by Ashar in 24 of July 2021. And I think that in the think of the army, they haven't the project, what will be the project of Qais Said. I think that they don't know what Qais Said will do. And I think that now, when they are looking what he's doing, the position, as you say, the position of the army, I think, will change, because the situation of the country is very, we are in a very bad, the country is in a very bad situation. And Qais Said is incompetent to conduct the affairs of of Tunisia. So I think that if there is a great reaction from Tunisian people with their problems, social, economic problems, and the situation will be not able to be controlled, I think that the army will have a reaction to stop this tragedy which Tunisia is now living with Qais Said.
Great. Andrew or Tariq, do you have some more insight into the role of the army?
I have lots of personal connections to the Tunisian army, but at the moment, I'm afraid that I'm not allowed to share that information. No, of course, I have no insider information about that whatsoever. But I will say, from an outside perspective, that the Tunisian military did not have the same status and role that the military did in Egypt. And so there's a precedence for the Tunisian military being willing to assume a purely professional and technocratic role and allow for a democratic process. And one would hope that there is enough support within the Tunisian military to allow that to happen again.
Tariq, anything to add?
I'll just add, perhaps it behooves us all to zoom out slightly and not just look at the Tunisian army, but also the Interior Ministry and the National Guard, and talk about the security services as a broader group. I mean, yes, the army was vital to implement the coup and to enable President Said's crackdowns. And I think from their perspective, they like this change to a clearer command and control structure. I think it's still the case that the army and the Interior Ministry have the most influence over the president's offices and the president's policy perspective, which I also think that they enjoy. But what I really worry about is that, you know, Andrew was saying President Said has not set down an apparatus or a deep state, which is very true. Said is a one-man show and not a great show at that. But in the background, it is these border security services who have been laying down this infrastructure. And what I'm concerned about is that, there was a hope that Said could restore some formality, some good command and control, but they didn't expect him to be this disastrous. So they'll stick with him until he becomes untenable. And then perhaps you see a more competent authoritarian take control. Perhaps somebody from the Interior Ministry steps forward. This is, has a precedent in Tunisian history. And they can use this infrastructure and the framework that President Said has created, his constitution and so on. They have a ready-made authoritarian state, basically, to take control of. And I think that this is something worth keeping an eye on and worth trying to plan for.
Okay, thank you.
Remarks. Don't forget that the army in 2011, during the revolution, the army support Tunisian people in 2011. So the history of the army is a patriotic history, and the army will be always near the people, I think, not with a dictator, I think.
Let's hope so, at least. We now go to Mr. Ghazi bin Ahmed. He's raising his hand, so I'm giving him the floor and inviting him to turn on his mic and his video if he wants. مرحبا بك سي غازي.
Aslama. Hello, good afternoon, and thank you for having me.
تفضل مرحبا.
Okay, so I'm Ghazi bin Ahmed. I'm the founder and the head of Tunisian think tank Mediterranean Development Initiative. We are also based in Brussels now since 2020. I would like to thank the organizers and the three panelists for very interesting debate and presentation. My think tank, MDI, is mostly focusing on the economic situation in the southern Mediterranean countries and Tunisia especially. We are apolitical, but very much concerned about the economic situation in Tunisia. We've been following what is happening on the economic and socio-economic front. We are very much concerned. We've been following especially the interaction between the different actors around the IMF-Tunisia deal. And I have a question. So we've seen how Italy is advocating for Tunisia to get a deal signed with IMF without conditions or with light conditions. They are currently negotiating that deal. The stumbling block or the Gordian knot, if you prefer, would be whether the IMF will insist on two conditions specifically, which are the removing subsidies and the public firms. We also know that Meloni will be received by Biden tomorrow. That she's offering to the United States a break with China, so she might be willing to again put Tunisia on her agenda and advocate for a deal with the US. We know that US have been very firm against the situation in Tunisia. So, do you think that this Italian advocacy may change the situation of the United States for Tunisia and for Tunisian deal with IMF? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ghazi.
You're welcome.
See, Abdelrazak, see Tariq, Andrew. So the first question is about the negotiations with the IMF. Where do you think they're headed? And the second question is about the position of the United States, and maybe it will be, or can it be changed based on the pressure being exerted by Italy?
Sir Radwan, excuse me, I go to the second question. I think that Meloni is looking for the interest of his country. As you know, Meloni in his election program, the first point that has promised is that he will fight the immigration. As you know, for her, it's a very important question. So I think, like our friend now who interviewed now, that Meloni will ask the President Biden to help Tunisia, because all body know that the position of the USA against Said is very clear. This position is to always asking him to the return of the democracy. So it may be an important question which Meloni will see with the President Biden.
Andrew or Tarek, do you have an answer about either the position of the US or the IMF negotiations?
Yeah, I mean, the Italians have been lobbying very hard for months now on the IMF deal. I mean, their perspective is that Tunis is close to economic collapse, which would be a catastrophe. It needs the cash injection. The money itself is more important than the conditions that are attached to the money. And they seem to have been quite successful in terms of influencing the other senior board members, the United States and other European countries. I mean, from my understanding, issues like subsidy reform and so on are put onto the back burner now. The IMF is no longer demanding all of the conditionality that it had before. But the main obstacle here is not the IMF right now, it's President Said. You know, as the saying goes, you can bring a horse to water and you can't make him drink. I think the Italians have dragged the proverbial horse into the middle of the lake and it's still not drinking. So there is no offer to the IMF coming from the Tunisian government. There is no indication that an offer is coming anytime soon. I think if one did come, it would be accepted very quickly, which is an indication of how successful the Italian lobbying has been. But yeah, it's the holdup is with President Said and not with the IMF. And it shows again on the US side of that question how important the Italian lobbying has been. The impression I get is that for the United States, Tunis is a European problem. They will make it as important as the Europeans want it to be as a favor to their allies. I don't think it's a US priority right now. I might be wrong, but that's the impression that I've got.
Just on the question of the IMF, I think from my contacts and my meetings with some of the IMF people, IMF has never really imposed any conditions, any specific conditions on Tunisia. All they said from the beginning is we need guarantees that you're going to be able to reform the economy so that you reduce the deficit as much as possible so that you are able to pay back the loan in 3 or 4 years. That's what the IMF requires. How you do that, how you reduce the deficit, and how you prove that your economy is going to be sustainable is up to you. It's up to the government to present a plan, to present a program that is convincing, that shows that, yes, there are significant economic reforms that will take place and that the economy is going to recover. And therefore, with this loan, it will help the economy to recover. And that, as you said, Tarek, the responsibility is on the Tunisian government to present a plan or present a program that shows how the reforms will take place and how the economy will be fixed and will become healthy again. And so far, they haven't done that. So I don't think it's that there is pressure from Italy or from anybody else. This is the policy of the IMF. They cannot give a loan to a country who does not reform the economy or who has no way of paying back the loan because the economy is in shambles, or anybody who will agree to do that will lose his job like any other bank. The bank, they have conditions that they must guarantee that the loan will be paid back. Otherwise they can't give to somebody who is not able to pay back the loan. Andrew, do you have anything to add about either the US role or the IMF?
No, I actually wanted to ask you whether you agreed with Tariq's last comment that it's not a US priority at all, and that it's something that the US allows European allies to sort of guide policy priorities on. You're the one in DC with speaking to people on more on a daily basis, so I was hoping you could say something about that.
Yeah, I think that Tunisia is not a high priority for the US. Of course, they have much bigger problems in other countries, like in China and even Yemen and Syria and Ukraine. Of course, right now is the biggest problem that the US is focusing on. Yemen, Iran, all these problems. There are so many fires all over the world that Tunisia cannot be the number one top priority for the US. But when they do think about Tunisia, or when they do think about the Arab world, I think democracy is still high on the list of priorities for the United States. I think that the US government, and especially Congress, feels that democracy is important, that we need to support democracy in the Arab world in general, and that in Tunisia specifically, which has shown the most potential for a successful transition to democracy, that's where we really need to continue to really push for a return to democracy. But as I think all of you mentioned, the US is not going to move alone. It needs to convince other allies, and more specifically, it's up to the Tunisian people really to decide. So the US is waiting to see what the Tunisian people will do. The US cannot be ahead of the Tunisian people in demanding democracy or pushing for democracy. I think that's the position of the United States right now. Okay, we'll go to the next question from Philippe in Colombia. Thanks for this event. It is clear that Said represents authoritarianism. However, when I observe a large part of the Tunisian people, I see that they are not interested in politics. And in seasons of the year like the current one, meaning the summer, they prefer to enjoy the summer in restaurants, beach, and fun. I would like to know what percentage you estimate to be against Qais Said currently. Thank you. So do you think that, what is the percentage of the Tunisian people who are against Qais Said right now? And what is the percentage, therefore, that is still with Qais Said or with the coup right now? Say, Abdrazak, we'll start with you.
I think, the last sondage, Qais Said is about 16 are with him. The last sondage, I think 3 months ago, I think. And now I think that with the bad situation, the bad situation which Tunisians are living, I think that his popularity is very, very bad. We don't know because we haven't seen sondage, and I think that people now begin to know that finally Qais Said haven't nothing to give them. So I think that now his popularity is very bad, I think.
If I could say something.
What is the percentage that you think is against him right now?
I think 20%, maximum 20%, I think.
20% with him?
With him, yes.
And what is the percentage against him?
You know, it depends. It depends of the situation. I think that the next 2 or 3 months will be very important to determine the popularity of Qais Said.
Andrew?
Yeah, I don't know percentages. I'm not going to speculate that. I'm sure that Dr. Abdelrazak is correct, but I wanted to say something in general in relation to Felipe's question, as well as some of the very, very interesting and perceptive questions that Professor William Lawrence has in the chat. One, these sorts of things are not fixed or static, right? It's not that people have a fixed position about these sorts of things and a fixed intensity. These sorts of things come and go with the behavior of other kinds of actors in political opposition. So, we know from opposition movements in Eastern Europe at the end of the 1980s, in Spain and Portugal and other places, that many people, their positions are responsive to what's going on in society. And this is why dictatorships do so much to both prevent, even very strong dictatorships do so much to prevent even what seems like to us very, very meaningless or harmless opposition, because they don't want to give people the perception that there are others that are with them, there are others that feel the same way, or that there are others that believe that the people have the capacity to overturn dictatorships. And so, it could be true, as Felipe says, that people want to be on the beach, they want to enjoy summer, but it's always true that the vast majority of people in a population are not very political, that people care about their daily lives, they care about economic survival, they care about their private lives. That's always true in every country. I don't think Tunisians are particular in that regard. But these things change. You see how quickly small movements like during the Arab Spring gather more and more people. A small protest in Tahrir grows and grows and grows until it includes millions. So that is how I think you need to think about the possibility for protest, that people, they join when they see certain thresholds of their fellow citizens engaging in these things, and they see the possibility for some kind of actual result out of protests and demonstrations. But my sense is that he's not particularly popular. We know the pathetic turnout that he had for his referendum and his elections to parliament, 8, 9%, 10%, 13%. People, the only way that we can really tell the level of enthusiasm is that people, what percentage of people turn out for even these sham elections, and the turnout is pitiful.
Thank you. Tariq, anything to add about that? About Qais Said popularity?
Just a quick point that, a lot of people, they talk about the polls, and with all of the caveats of the problem of polling in Tunis, especially now, you see President Said with a slight majority, you see somebody like Abir Morsi, who's not that much better on the democratic scale, as second, and people point to this and they say, oh, look, Said is still popular. But the real story that these polls tell is that the complete support for all the political actors, it never adds up to more than a third of the entire electorate. Most of the electorate doesn't like any of them. They're completely disconnected now, which kind of builds on what both Felipe and Andrew were saying. But I think that the prevailing mood right now is nihilism, which is what I was saying before, and what is dangerous, because people don't see a way out. We tried the revolution thing, didn't work out. Now we're trying the dictator thing, also doesn't work out. So what do you want from us? Either they stay or they go. Yeah. So he's not very popular, but neither is anybody else, unfortunately.
Yeah, and Tariq, I agree with you about the polls. First of all, a lot of the companies that do the polls are for-profit companies. They are not regulated at all. And they are not non-profit, they are doing this for profit. They are companies that want to make money, and there's been a lot of evidence in the past that they receive money from people to increase their ratings in the polls. This was done even during the Democratic time, the phase, the 10 years. Abir Musi before 2019 was also ranked either number 1 or number 2, but when we had elections in 2019, she and her party came as number 4 and number 5. So a big difference, between what she was getting in the polls before 2019 and what actually happened in 2019 when I think she got she was the 5th, behind 4 other parties. Also, in a time of dictatorship, there is fear. I guarantee you that if you did the poll during the Ben Ali era, even 1 week before the spring or the revolution in December 2010, the poll would show that Ben Ali has 70 or 80 or maybe even 90% popularity, because people are afraid. Nobody will tell you when you're asking him, whether in front of his house or even in the street, whether you are against Ben Ali or for Ben Ali. Nobody will tell you, oh, I'm against Ben Ali, because they don't know who you are and they don't know how this information will be used against them. There is an atmosphere of fear now that has been, it's not a democracy anymore. Yes, you can do polling in a democracy, but I think it's really ridiculous to do polling in a dictatorship when people are literally afraid to speak to strangers or to really say what's on their mind, because there could be severe repercussions. Anyway, let's go to William Lawrence, Professor William Lawrence from American University. William, you have the floor. I'm sorry, I clicked on the wrong button. So now we have what happened? Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Ben.
Sorry, I'm on my phone, and you had to promote me, and that took a minute.
Yes.
I put a couple questions in the chat, but let me start just quickly on the issue of polling, and then on the IMF briefly as well. While maybe Tara can look at his question, Andrew began to answer his. But on polling, you can poll in a dictatorship by asking tricky questions, proxy questions, and cross-referencing the data. But it's a real art, and none of the Tunisian polling institutions are using that. If you look, for example, at the Arab Center polls and some of the others, they'll use these really sophisticated types ways of asking questions in the negative or in the proxy form, where you just express satisfaction or dissatisfaction about something without actually talking about the head of state. There are ways to do it, but none of the Tunisian polls were looking at it, and therefore I agree entirely with what Radwan's saying on the how bad the polling data is. They could be doing a lot better, though. In terms of the IMF, I wanted to add a couple things to the conversation, because I've been talking to the IMF as well. First of all, the Saudis promised $500 million as part of the IMF deal privately. And so now that the Saudis have given $500 million outside of that structure, I'm not even sure the IMF has the 1.3 billion right now. They said it wasn't coming from the Europeans when I talked to them privately. So I think they're going to have to find a new source for a big chunk of the IMF funds if they even negotiate the deal. I agree with a lot of what was said, but let me add, there's already agreement on subsidies that UGTT agrees to in the IMF. There's already agreement on wages, which actually the IMF really likes. And on the private companies, which Ghazi mentioned, the issue, and I put this in the chat, is mainly that Tunisia made a bunch of promises with the last 2 IMF bailouts that they didn't keep. So there's an issue of, are you going to at least do the things you told us you would do them last time, in keeping with what Radwan said, because the country itself negotiates what it wants to do. According to the IMF, the problem right now is between Said and his own ministers. His ministers want the deal to stabilize the macroeconomic situation, fight hyperinflation and all the things we know about, address the food crisis, everything else, purchasing power of Tunisians. Said is wondering if he can get away without the deal. With this 1.1 billion from the Europeans, it's the full amount, the 500 million from Saudi Arabia, with increasing taxes, which he thinks can really help, which it won't, and a couple of other bad ideas. He thinks he might be able to weather this storm without an IMF deal, and he's wrong. But the only debate now is not between Washington and Rome or between the IMF and anybody. It's between Said and his ministers, and he keeps refusing not to sign the deal that's already negotiated. On Tarek, my question was if now I have to remind myself. You basically said that the opposition should be focused on economics, and in the abstract, I sort of agree with you in that economics was always the bigger problem and issue than politics. And we wrote this in the crisis report I co-authored in 2012, and it's always been the case. But I don't think the opposition can meet legally. They can't propose any policies. If they propose anything or do anything, they're immediately arrested and often imprisoned. Certainly the parties aren't allowed to present anything. And if they do anything, they're called traitors and vermin and cancers and everything else by this president, who immediately disqualifies what they're doing. So the idea that somehow the parties, or even the parties in exile, or that somehow the population can organize itself and present economic proposals is kind of bonkers in this political environment. And so that second point you made, I just don't know how we get there from here. And certainly shutting up about politics acquiesces to the coup to some degree, basically saying we don't need democracy to get our economic needs met, and you can do whatever you want, be in charge, just please take, some economic advice from us, and we're fine with which was always the dictators compromise with populations going back decades in the Middle East. Let us handle politics and we'll, give you a little bit of what you want in economics, a formula that never is sustainable and never works for the long term. And then Andrew, I just asked a question about, why be optimistic about the appetite of Tunisians for freedoms and the resilience they have, the legacy of having overthrown a dictator, if they're clearly indicating now they don't want to go into the street. And when you talk about that resilience, to use my word, are you just talking about future protests, or are you talking about something? Thank you, Redwan, for including me.
Thank you, Bill. Tarek?
Yeah, thank you for all those points, Bill, and it's nice to see you again. I still beg to differ. Like, I understand completely where you're coming from on this. But look, as things stand right now, the opposition is under siege. The big kind of show arrests have been done. People can still meet and still chat as long as you do it relatively subtly. You can still publish points. You can still publish perspectives. People even talk on news channels sometimes. You don't even have to publish under your personal name. The general position I'm taking is to say that politicians should stop talking to Said and start talking to the people, and start to say, like, look, we understand the position that you're in. We understand that you're suffering, and this is how we would like to get you out of it. And then all of a sudden, people start to say, well, Said, why aren't you doing this? And it creates another pressure source on Said, and especially if you kind of publish under a general name, the National Salvation Front or something like that. Sure, one or two of these poor additional politicians might be arrested, but you can't take down the broader alliance.
Okay, and
but yeah, this is my point. Talk to the people, try to rally the people, try to resonate with them, because just by talking about politics, it hasn't gotten them anywhere over the last 2 years. All Said has done is tighten the noose. So it's time to try something
convince
new.
them. Basically, what you're saying, Tarek, is convince them that you have solutions, that you can do better, that you can do better than Qais Said.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, Andrew, do you have an answer to Bill's question about what makes you think, or what makes you more optimistic that Tunisians care about freedom and democracy?
Yeah, first I really appreciated Bill's interventions. Very, very informed, very interesting. I'm glad he was able to do that. I don't remember being overly optimistic about the Tunisian people per se right now. I think I said something to the effect that that they're in times of protest that the Tunisian protesters have a reason to have self-belief that that they overthrew a dictator before, and that I do believe that the levels of repression and the willingness of the state to use mass violence against its own people is less than in Syria, less than in Egypt, and so forth. So, as he said at the end, is it a point about the future? Yes, it's not. There isn't great evidence right now of popular unrest, but these things are resources that are in reserve. We didn't think this was the case in Tunisia in November or December of 2010, and yet it emerged. And so, yeah, so that's the extent of my optimism about that. I believe that there's a precedent for achieving something through popular protest against a regime, and there remain protests ongoing. And so just in terms of the sorts of things that give us some cause for optimism about a path to democracy, that would be one of them.
Okay, we're running almost out of time, but I'd like to take 3 more questions very quickly. The first one is from Sajid Iqbal Sheikh, and it's in chat. It says, as mentioned by Andrew, Tunisian model was a hope for a whole democratic loving world. Can we say that the situation is intimating a failure to the theory and practice of political Islam? Is this a failure of political Islam in Tunisia?
I mean, I don't think so. I think what somebody might say is, in a democratic context in which political Islam, such as it is, receives the support of somewhere between, depending on the election, 20 and 40% of the population, how relevant is political Islam? And what do you mean by political Islam as an ideology or as an alternative to the modern secular state? And so Ennahda was never fully in power. It itself, in 2016, formally declared that it did not belong to political Islam, but adopted the ideology of Muslim democracy, was never attempting to create an Islamic state or an Islamic alternative to the regime. It was one of the primary authors of the Constitution of 2014, which was almost entirely secular. And so if what you mean by a failure of political Islam, if the measure is that the point of political Islam is to win and to monopolize all power, then certainly that was not accomplished. But there's no evidence that this is what Ennahda wanted or saw as possible or saw as desirable in Tunisia. So I just don't think it's relevant to speak about the end of democracy in Tunisia 2 years ago as having anything really to do with political Islam in a broad sense.
Abdrazak, anything to add about
Yes, I think
Islam?
we cannot talk about political Islam in Tunisia. Tunisia, for example, is not like Egypt. I think that in Tunisia, we can talk about democratic Islam because we have a party which is Ennahda, which is in fact a democratic Islam, which choose a democratic Islam, and we have Ennahda have show this when he voted the constitution of 2014. This constitution, which was adopted and voted by Ennahda when Ennahda was have the majority in the parliament, and this constitution consacred the freedom of conscience, the freedom of thoughting, the freedom of religion. So it consacre civil state. So I think that in Tunisia we have to outside Tunisia we have to stop to talk about political Islam, because in Tunisia I think we have passed this step, and Tunisia people in Tunisia are looking for a democratic country, a democratic system, which Qais Said has stopped, unfortunately has stopped.
Okay, we now go to Marco Di Donato. He's going to ask the question by voice and audio video. Hi, Marco.
Hi, thank you very much for having me. Thank you, Radwan. Thank you, all the panelists. Let me briefly introduce myself. I am a researcher, senior researcher at University of Palermo in Italy. And I have just a quick comment and a question. First of all, the quick comments about this perception that we always have about Arab world and Arab people, especially before 2011 or even after 2011, like people that are just waiting or preferring to enjoy summer and this kind of things as the other question arrived. But basically the history of this region is telling us something different. And the history of the region is telling us of a history of continuous contention, as has been recognized, for example, one of the last book of John Chalcroft and Popular Politics in the Making of the Middle East. My question is about, shall we reconsider, for all the panelists, shall we reconsider 2011, in 2011 revolution results? Shall we reconsider a little bit the dynamics also 2011 for understanding Qais Said, as you described it, coup and regime? And the other question seems to me there is another big elephant in the room that we didn't discuss, is the role of the UGTT. In especially a moment of economic crisis, how do you consider the UGTT role? And especially considering that UGTT role has been ambiguous through the history of Tunisia. So I would like to ask you this, and let me say that I also totally agree with what Professor March said with respect to political Islam. Every time we are here trying to make funerals to political Islam here and that, but at the end of the day, in free election, we always see that, as it's been in Egypt, is one of the first party obtaining results. Thank you very much, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Marco. So the question is about the role of the UGTT. It's been said that it is the strongest labor union in the Arab world, but lately it has been kind of silent and really not pushing for any kind of economic or political reforms. Why do you think that's the case? What's happening with the UGTT? Abdrazak, maybe we'll start with you.
Wallahi, Sir Radwan, I don't like to speak about UGTT because now I don't recognize UGTT. UGTT, me, I know UGTT of Hashed, which believe in values of democracy and freedoms. Now, unfortunately, l'UGTT is in a situation of organization which not fighting for the laborers. I think that the direction of GTT is calculate with political ideas. So I can't have any more comments.
Okay. Andrew or Tariq, do you have something to add about the role of the UGTT?
No.
No? Tariq, you nodded also no?
Yeah, it's a very quick point. Much like Abdurrazzaq, I would say that the UGTT has changed. I think popularly it's perceived as part of the problem by many people now, and it's also a split organization. It's not an effective force.
Okay. We're going to last question from Mr. Muaz Zemni. I think he's a Tunisian, American Tunisian who lives here in Washington, D.C. Go ahead, Muaz. Muaz? Muaz, can you hear me?
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes,
Hello?
go ahead, please. Very quickly.
Yes, thank you. Save the best for last, right? Okay, thank
Yes.
you, everyone. My question is, I think the Tunisian people maybe are not interested in democracy. And like Obama said at one point, democracy is messy. So maybe they don't have the stamina to sustain and really have this prise de conscience, حالة الوعي. There's no awareness. And if we're going to let it play out, it's going to be long, long path forward. Your question about presentation is how to bring democracy back. The answer, as far as I can see, is going to who is behind this tree. So look at the forest that's hiding, behind this tree. Tree is Qais Said. Who's supporting him? Who's among the القوى الصلبة, the hard power, the nexus of the group or the gang supporting him? As we saw, the Egyptian intelligence officers were right in the palace when they stripped Meshishi of his government, of his role, and heavily interrogated him and beat him up. So this is a playbook of the Egyptian and the UAE. Where is he now? He was in France, now he's in Qatar. This Meshishi, this is the big mystery of what happened. So the quickest way forward to get out of this is to go and maybe strike a deal with who's supporting Qais Said, because I can't count on the people. They're sleepy. The UGTT has never been with the people. He always been with the. I agree totally with Dr. Kilani. The UGTT, historically speaking, always been siding with the regimes in place. This is a coup the Tunisian way. It's not a coup the Egyptian way. It's been a coup with a baby step policy. Each step of the way, the coup leader, basically put step by step. He followed his own narrative that was dictated by the force that's behind him, supporting him. Could be the deep state, could be the UAE. So again, the only way forward, the quickest way to have the nexus of the military change their mind and drop their support of Qais Said. The other initiative by the Quartet, the Mubadra, is dead on arrival. So it's just, in the drawer and has no chance to move forward. What do you think? Thank you.
Thank you, Muaz. We're out of time. So if each of you has maybe 1 minute or 1.5 minutes to answer Muaz's question and to any other points that you would like to conclude with. We'll start with Abdurrazzaq.
How to return to the democracy? I think that people will return to the democracy. Tunisian people will compare their situation before the coup and after the coup. Now the situation of human rights is very bad. today people are investigated or persecuted merely for the exercise and their rights to freedom of expression. The charges against them include insulting the authorities or spreading fake. And by using Decree Law 54, draconian cybercrime decree law that affords the authority wide-ranging powers to crack down on freedom of expression online. Today, people are looking for the violation of the independence of judiciary. They are looking for the dismantled institutional human rights safeguards. They are looking for the incited discrimination against migrants. So it's not what the revolution of freedom and dignity has give us. I think that Tunisian people will now know that Qais Said is in fact a criminal person, and I think that with all this situation, no people, their situation, they even the water is stopped during 4 or 6 days. The electricity also, they have pain of electricity. So the situation, the life of Tunisian actually is very, very, very bad. So people will compare before the revolution, before the coup and after the coup. And to conclude, I think that Tunisian government today has to respect his international human rights obligation. You know that Tunisian government state has obligation to respect human rights. So I launch this appeal to the international community, to the people who believe in values of freedom and democracy, to ask to our government, to ask to Qais Said to stop this tragedy.
Thank you, Abdrazak. Tariq, any closing remarks?
No, I mean, the time is short. I don't want to drag it out. I feel we've all made the points. Just to reiterate what you were all saying, and that the situation is getting exponentially worse. And so it's on, but Said will not provide a solution to anybody. And so I think that it behooves everybody to look at what comes next, to start planning for that moment when people realize that Said cannot provide. You have to look forward and to plan for what's next, and to call on as much international support for that moment as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Andrew.
Just the final point to reiterate that democratic transitions can come out of nowhere unexpectedly. Nobody predicted December 2010, January 2011. This isn't a formula that you bake a cake with and you get the same result every time. There could be some trigger, some kind of event that brings out all of the underlying frustration. And in my opinion, the opposition needs to be ready for that. It needs to be discussing what to do in the right circumstances, but also needs to learn from the 10 years of parliamentary democracy. What went wrong? Why was it not able to develop greater loyalty amongst the population? And beyond that, there's really no way of predicting what's going to happen.
Thank you.
Thank you for organizing this, Radwan.
Thank you all. It was a very, very, I think, illuminating and enlightening discussion about the current state of affairs in Tunisia. I personally remain very optimistic that democracy will come back to Tunisia. I don't know when exactly, whether in the next 6 months or year or 2 years. But I feel that the Tunisian people, yes, they were disappointed with democracy, or during the democratic transition 10 years, they didn't get everything that they wanted or everything that they expected to have after 8 or 9 years of the democratic transition. But I think now they also are very disappointed with dictatorship, and they know they can compare basically that even with its shortcomings, the democratic transition was light years ahead and light years better than dictatorship. And I think this is an important lesson for everybody to learn, that dictatorship is never the answer. You know, democracy has its problems and its shortcomings, but dictatorship is much worse and never offers any real solutions or real improvements in the life of Tunisians. And I think the Tunisians now are learning that lesson. It's a hard lesson to learn, but I think it's becoming more and more clear every day. So thank you very much for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you in the future at a future event. Thank you. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you, Abdulrazak. Thank you, Tarek. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.
Assalamu. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Shukran.